The holidays. Time to gather with those we love. A time for good food and good friends. A time for family togetherness. A time for family fun. A time for family dysfunction? No, that's not right. You guys, I'm trying to talk about love and togetherness at the holidays over here. Can we get it together? Can we at least make it through dinner? Can you pipe down? Pipe down! I said pipe down! That's better. But if your holidays seem more dysfunctional than fun, it might be time to set a new course, to create a new family culture. But don't worry, you're not alone. We all have a little holiday family dysfunction.
We survived Thanksgiving, it looks like. I don't see any black eyes. Nobody's got any arms in a sling. So, good job. Gold star all around. We survived Thanksgiving. Now, there's a catch to that, though, because I wasn't at the table with you. And I wasn't in the den after dinner. So I can't say for sure if maybe for some of us, Thursday just kind of confirmed that we need to lean in as the people of God and find a better way forward to deal with the dysfunction that can so easily define our families. Because part of the issue that we began exploring last week is that we have gotten really, really good at pushing it all down, squeezing it all together so we can just make it through dinner. And so the fact that a fist fight didn't break out may not mean that everything is okay. And so we want to press a bit further into this conversation today. Because whether a fight broke out or whether you pushed it all down and made it through dinner, Thursday might have confirmed that things are not all as they should be. That there are some broken relationships, some things that need attention within the cultures of our family. And so if you were with us last week, you might remember that in this conversation we're exploring the story of a family from the Old Testament. The story of a man named Jacob. And we're looking into his family story. And as a reminder, Jacob is the grandson of Father Abraham. He is the son of Isaac, the child of promise. And Jacob himself, he will be the father of the 12 men who become the 12 tribes of Israel. So this is a key story, a key figure in the Old Testament, a key family dynamic for us to understand. Also, you might remember that Jacob is the younger of twin sons. And that in the midst of the family dynamic, his father Isaac and his mother Rebekah each chose their favorite child. That Isaac favored Esau, the older brother, the huntsman, the man of the field. But Rebekah loved Jacob. You might remember how even before these twin boys were born, there was a prophetic word that would seem to set their life course. That while their mother was pregnant, there was a jostling in her womb that concerned her something may be wrong. And so she inquired of the Lord what was going on, and a prophetic word was given to her. The word of the Lord came and said, there are two children in your womb, two nations who will vie with one another, and the older will serve the younger. And those prophetic words seem to loom large when the children were born, and Jacob, the younger son, emerged second from the womb, grasping the heel of his brother Esau. You might remember that this story is set up for family dysfunction. All of that set the stage for the life of Jacob and his brother Esau, and it set the stage for this conversation we began about holiday family dysfunction. And we began exploring last week 3 principles of dysfunction that will kind of guide our thinking over the course of this series. We want to review them each week so that we have them fresh in mind. If you were with us last week, these will sound familiar, hopefully. And they go like this. The first one says that family dysfunction exists because of broken relationships. Right? The reason things aren't as they should be within our families is because there are relationships that have been broken. That's where family dysfunction ultimately comes from. It exists because of broken relationships. And when we begin to understand that we live in a world that is broken by sin and its effects, that all of us, to some degree, in varying ways, are ourselves broken people, it starts to make sense why we have to all deal with this. Right? And so we start to begin to feel like it's inevitable. And so the second principle we looked at says that in a broken world, family dysfunction probably isn't optional. But normalizing it is. Right? If we live in a broken world and we're all broken people, I'm broken, you're broken, the people in all of our families are broken, then it's probably not optional that at some point some of those relationships are going to fracture. There's going to be the seeds of dysfunction. It's probably not optional for those things to happen. But what is optional for us, particularly as the people of God, striving to follow the ways and words of Jesus, is to normalize those things. To begin to say, well, that's just how it is. To begin to act as if they are okay. And that's where this third principle of family dysfunction comes in. We said that your family dysfunction can undo your family culture, or your family culture can undo your family dysfunction. Right? So what we were just saying, how we sometimes normalize this stuff, we push it all down, we squeeze it so that we can just get through dinner. That's what it looks like for our dysfunction to undo our family culture. Because now, the mess is just normal. That's just how things are. That's just the way we operate. We're just that family. And the culture of our family has been undone by our dysfunction. But the good news of Jesus says that the opposite is just as true, that your family culture, when we begin to root it in the ways and words of Jesus, can begin to undo that dysfunction, can undermine those things that are rooted in our own brokenness. And so today, as we get a little bit further into Jacob's story, what we're going to see happen is that there are some patterns that begin to emerge. And we're going to see today how some of those patterns echo what had come before Jacob's life. And we're going to see the way in which those patterns are reflected in what comes after Jacob's life. Okay, so we're going to see the way this story kind of hinges some of the things that we were just refreshing our memories about from last week, because times will change. But sin has a pretty tried and true pattern. Right? The enemy knows there are some things that work to undermine righteousness and holiness in your life, in my life, in the lives of our families. And so he's going to keep going back to the same well. So times change, but sin's patterns are pretty tried and true. And so when we begin to examine Jacob's life, the story of this family, in light of the good news of Jesus, in light of Jesus' death and resurrection, what we can begin to do is learn from the places they got it right and learn from the places they got it wrong and begin to ask, what does the power of the gospel to transform and change us have to say to our own realities? So, let's shake off the last remnants of that turkey coma, all right? Let's forget for a minute there's still leftover pie in the fridge, and we'll dive back into Jacob's story this morning. I invite you to turn with me to Genesis chapter 25. Genesis chapter 25. And we're going to pick up essentially where we left off last week, if you're with us for week 1 of this series. And if you're tracking along in the YouVersion Bible app, you can find today's text. All of the teaching notes, anything on the screen will be there. You can jot some things down, take some notes if that's helpful for you. We're going to begin in Genesis chapter 25 with verse 27, where we read that the boys grew up. And Esau became a skillful hunter, a man of the open country, while Jacob was a quiet man, staying among the tents. This is what we saw last week. Then Isaac, who had a taste for wild game, loved Esau, but Rebekah loved Jacob. Once, when Jacob was cooking some stew, Esau came in from the open country, famished. He said to Jacob, "Quick, let me have some of that red stew. I'm famished." That's why he's called Edom. Jacob replied, "First, sell me your birthright." "Look, I'm about to die," Esau said. "What good is my birthright to me?" But Jacob said, "Swear to me first." So he swore an oath to him, selling his birthright to Jacob. And then Jacob gave Esau some bread and some lentil stew. He ate it and drank, and then he got up and left. So Esau despised his birthright. So Esau goes out into the field to do what he does. He's a huntsman. He's a man of the field. It's why his father loves him so much. And he comes in from a long hunt, and he's hungry, and he's famished, and he sees his brother cooking a pot of stew, and he says, "Hey, brother, give me some soup." And he says, "I would be happy to give you some soup. But first, I'm going to need you to give me your birthright." Right? Like, this seems like a really outsized request, right? Like, it seems like this is kind of a very uneven trade. And so Esau, for whatever reason, maybe he's thinking he understands the way the culture works. He's the older brother. Nothing's going to change that. That means that he stands in line to receive a double portion of the inheritance. It means he stands in line to receive his father's blessing. He stands in line to receive his father's place at the head of the family clan. And so he says, "Sure, little brother, you can have my birthright. I'm starving to death, and if I die, it doesn't mean anything to me anyway." And so Esau makes the trade. And we're not told exactly what's going on in his mind, whether he's so convinced of his place, his status, that nothing seems to be able to challenge that he's the oldest son. He's the one who stands to inherit the child of promise narrative. But what the text does tell us is that Esau despised his birthright. Whatever we make of Jacob's offer, we're to understand that in this moment, Esau chose poorly. And if we were to continue reading the very next section of the text, the story jumps back to Isaac. We're back to the story of Daddy now. And what we would find, if we took the time to read the next section of Isaac's story, is we would begin to hear some things that echo what we heard happening in the life of his father, Abraham. A famine breaks out in the land, and the word of the Lord comes to Isaac and tells him, "Don't go to Egypt." That was kind of the common practice of the day. Egypt was a place that people often went in times of trouble. And the word of the Lord comes to Isaac and says, "Don't go to Egypt in the midst of this famine. Stay in the land that I have brought your father to, the land that I have promised to your descendants. Don't go to Egypt." And so Isaac obeys, and he stays in the land that his father had come to and settled into. And he soon comes under the care, under the guardianship, if you will, of Abimelech, the king of the Philistines. And all of a sudden, Isaac's story takes a very familiar turn if we know the story of his father, Abraham. The text tells us that Isaac was nervous about Abimelech and his intentions. He was nervous particularly because of the beauty of his wife Rebekah, and he feared what might be done to him if Abimelech or any of his lesser lords began to desire Rebekah for themselves. They would come and kill Isaac, take her and all that he had, and that would bring this whole child of promise story to an end pretty quickly. And so, Isaac tells Abimelech, king of the Philistines, that Rebekah is his sister. Now, if we'd been reading the story of Abraham since Genesis 12, we would all of a sudden hear some bells going off in our minds, because this is the exact same trick that Abraham pulled with his wife Sarah before Isaac was even born. And all of these threads of Abraham's story begin to coalesce and come together in Isaac, the child of promise. And he begins to reflect his father in good ways and in bad. Abraham believed God, and it was credited unto him as righteousness. The word of the Lord came to Abraham, "Go, leave your father, your household, your family, and go to the land I will show you." And so he went. The word of the Lord comes to Isaac and says, "Don't leave the land." Now we're in the land. Don't leave the land. The land is a key piece of the promise. And we begin to see how Isaac's life is mirroring and reflecting choices and decisions of his father Abraham. Often without comment, often without evaluation, whether it is good, whether it is bad. Genesis just seems to present us with these parallel lives of these two men. And I think we can begin to get some insight into this family dysfunction that we're talking around and about in this conversation. It's there in the teaching notes if you want to jot it down. Our family culture isn't genetic, but it is inherited. Today's dysfunction is often rooted in yesterday's choices. Right? Our family culture isn't genetic, but it is inherited. And oftentimes, today's dysfunction is the result of yesterday's choices. We begin to hear the way that these stories echo, and this scene where Isaac passes off his bride as his sister will not be the last time that these stories echo one another. Let's pick the story back up in Genesis chapter 27, because this now is the link that moves us forward in the story of Jacob and his brother Esau. In Genesis chapter 27. I want to put this whole scene before us, and then we'll walk through some things here. When Isaac was old, and his eyes were so weak that he could no longer see, he called for Esau, his older son, and said to him, "My son?" "Here I am," he answered. Isaac said, "I am now an old man, and I don't know the day of my death. Now then, get your weapons, your quiver and bow, and go out into the open country to hunt some wild game for me. Prepare me the kind of tasty food I like, and bring it to me to eat, so that I may give you my blessing before I die." Verse 5, now Rebekah was listening as Isaac spoke to his son Esau. And so when Esau left for the open country to hunt game and to bring it back, Rebekah said to her son Jacob, "Look, I overheard your father say to your brother Esau, 'Bring me some game and prepare me some tasty food to eat so that I may give you my blessing in the presence of the Lord before I die.'" Let's pause because I want to make sure we don't miss something here. We know this story oftentimes, and so we can read right past it because we know where we're going, we know where we're getting to. But did you note the way in which the text described the relationship between each parent and the son they're speaking to? Isaac said to his son Esau, Rebekah said to her son Jacob. Now, okay, that both of those statements are equally valid and true, right? They are just objective reality, mother and son, father and son. But in light of what we know about these relationships, that each parent has a favorite son who they are now setting up to receive the blessing, it's probably significant that Genesis very subtly is reminding us of that broken reality in the family. Let's jump back into the text here. Verse 8. This is still Rebekah speaking. "Now, my son, listen carefully and do what I tell you. Go out to the flock and bring me 2 choice young goats so I can prepare some tasty food for your father just the way he likes it. Then take it to your father to eat so that he may give you his blessing before he dies." And her words to Jacob very intentionally echo and parallel Isaac's words to his brother Esau. Verse 11, Jacob said to Rebekah, his mother, "But my brother Esau is a hairy man, and I'm a man with smooth skin. What if my father touches me? I would appear to be tricking him, and he would bring down a curse on myself rather than a blessing." His mother said to him, "My son, let the curse fall on me. Just do what I say. Go and get them for me." So he went, and he got them, and he prepared them to his mother, or brought them to his mother, and she prepared some tasty food just the way his father liked it. Then Rebekah took the best clothes of Esau, her older son, which she had in the house, and put them on her younger son, Jacob. She covered his hands and the smooth part of his neck with the goat skins. Then she handed her son Jacob the tasty food and the bread she had made. And he went to his father and said, "My father." "Yes, my son," he answered. "Who is it?" And Jacob said to his father, "I'm Esau, your firstborn. I have done as you told me. Please set up and eat some of my game so that you may give me your blessing." Isaac asked his son, "How did you find it so quickly, my son?" "The Lord your God gave me success," he replied. Then Isaac said to Jacob, "Come near so that I can touch you, my son, to know whether you really are my son Esau or not." Jacob went close to his father Isaac, who touched him and said, "The voice is the voice of Jacob, but the hands are the hands of Esau." And he did not recognize him, for his hands were hairy like those of his brother Esau. And so he blessed him. "Are you really my son Esau?" he asked. "I am," he replied. Then he said, "My son, bring me some of your game to eat so that I may give you my blessing." And Jacob brought it to him, and he ate, and he brought some wine, and he drank. And then his father Isaac said to him, "Come here, my son, and kiss me." So he went to him and kissed him, and when Isaac caught the smell of his clothes, he blessed him. So Isaac, with his health failing and his eyesight having already failed, recognizes that his time is drawing short. So he calls for his oldest son Esau that he might bless him. This blessing is an integral moment in the passing of the lineage and the headship of the family. So he calls for Esau and says, "Go out into the field, hunt the way you do. And make the food you know I like. Bring it to me so that I can bless you." So Esau goes out, and we're told that Rebekah overhears what Isaac says to his son. And so she calls for her son Jacob and says, "Hey, your father is about to give his blessing to your brother Esau that will make him the heir of the promises. So here's what we're going to do. Go bring me a goat, and I will prepare your father's food just the way he likes it. And you can take it to him, and you can get the blessing." Now, to his credit, perhaps, Jacob objects, at least initially. But not because he's opposed to deceiving his father. He's just not sure it will work. Right? His objection is not, "Mother, how could I? How could I lie to my dying father?" His objection is not rooted in the deception. His objection is, "But mother, my brother Esau is a hairy man, and my skin is smooth. And so if my father touches me, he's going to know the jig is up, and then he's going to curse me rather than bless me." And I don't think we should miss the weight of Rebekah's words when she says, "My son, let the curse fall on me. Just go get me the goats." And I think if we're reading this story the way we usually read the story, there's this thing in us that goes, "Man, this Rebekah is a piece of work." I mean, she's willing to tell her son to lie to her dying husband on his deathbed so that her son, her favorite child, gets the blessing. She will do anything to look out for mama's baby boy, right? Like some of y'all are having fast flashbacks all of a sudden. You're like, I know that. Oh, all of a sudden this story makes a lot more sense. What is she thinking? Is there anything that we've heard within the story so far that can help us make sense of this? What if in this moment, as she overhears her ailing husband Isaac talking about blessing his older son Esau before he dies, what if all she hears rolling through her mind are the prophetic words, "The older will serve the younger"? And now with Isaac nearing the end of his life, she's not sure how the thing that God said would happen is going to happen. And so, she decides it's up to her to step in and help. Now, before we go too far, I'm not sure that excuses her decisions, okay? But it may help us understand the bigger picture just a little bit better. Because up to this point, in the limited narration that we get about Isaac and his life, we hear all of these ways in which his life echoes his father, Abraham. And now, perhaps, it seems that Rebekah's life, Rebekah's choices, begin to echo those of her mother-in-law, Sarah. You might remember Abraham was an older gentleman when the word of the Lord came to him and said, I will make you a great nation. I will give you descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and the sand of the seashore. If you could count that, you could count the number of descendants you will have. And you might remember there's one big glaring problem. He and Sarah are in the late stages of life and have no children. And so as there is this tension in Abraham's story that we have the promise of God for the child of promise, but we have no child of promise. And for a while, the way the story unfolds, it seems like maybe Abram's nephew Lot is going to be the heir. Maybe Lot's the guy. And that proves to be a fool's errand. And then Abraham has convinced himself that it will be his servant, Eliezer of Damascus. He's the guy who will inherit all that I have because I still don't have a son. And the Lord comes to him again and says, Abraham, you're not getting this. Your son, your flesh and blood will inherit the promises. But Sarah isn't getting any younger. And she hasn't gotten any more pregnant. So let's listen in to what happens in Genesis 16. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. But she had an Egyptian maidservant named Hagar. So she said to Abraham, the Lord has kept me from having children, so go, sleep with my maidservant. Perhaps I can build a family through her. Abram agreed to what Sarah said. So after Abram had been living in Canaan 10 years, Sarah, his wife, took her Egyptian maidservant Hagar and gave her to his husband to be his wife. He slept with Hagar, and she conceived. The next line is telling. When she knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. So we have a promise of a child, but no child. And Sarah looks around and isn't sure how the thing that God said would happen is going to happen. So she steps in to help. She offers Abraham her handmaiden Hagar. Now, while that is a bit more culturally at home in the world of the ancient Near East than it is in our culture, as you might imagine, it still leads to some dysfunction. Okay? Nobody saw the problems coming with this plan, right? Hagar conceives a child, and initially she runs away. She goes into the wilderness. And the angel of the Lord appears to her and tells her to go home. Because it turns out once she had a baby, Sarah, whose idea it was for her to have a baby, not a big fan of the fact that she had a baby. So Hagar returns home. And if you know Abraham's story, you know that eventually Sarah conceives and gives birth to a son. A boy his parents name Isaac, the child of promise. And once she has a son of her own, Sarah orders Hagar out of the house. And in Genesis 25, we read that Abraham left all that he had to his beloved son Isaac. And to his other children born to him by his concubines, he gave gifts while he was still alive and sent them away. To begin to hear the way these stories echo one another, the way in which the dysfunction of today is the result of yesterday's choices. The lies, the manipulations, choosing a favorite child, similarities layer into the story, and we are reminded that our family culture isn't genetic, but it sure is inherited. And that today's dysfunction is usually rooted in the result of yesterday's choices. And times change. But sin has some tried and true methods. And so what plagued this family can very easily and oftentimes does plague our families. And generational sins begin to echo across the years, across the generations, from one family patriarch or matriarch to the next. And if we were to fast forward this, what we would find out is some of these patterns not only are echoes of what has come before Jacob's life, they're going to echo in what comes after him. Because Jacob himself will have a favorite son, Joseph, who he gifts what some have called an amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. You might have heard that story. And it causes the same kind of dysfunction for his sons that it has caused between him and his brother. We get this reality of the way that these generational sins echo through this story, and the way that they can easily echo through our own families. And we find out that when we settle in and begin to normalize the sins of the past, we're ensuring that the sins of the present will become the sins of the future. Right? That's why it's so important for us to undo and root out the dysfunction, because once we begin to normalize it, it just gets passed on. And then it gets passed on again. And again, and in time, well, that's just the way it is. I guess that's just who we are. We're just that family. But if you've been tracking with us throughout today, one of the themes we tried to layer in early is the Advent season is about hope, right? And there's a sense when we get to this point and we hear the way in which these generational sins echo throughout this story, we go, this doesn't sound very hopeful. It sounds like a cycle that's just going to keep going and keep going and keep going. And the hope that the Advent season reminds us of is rooted in the good news of Jesus. Because yes, today's dysfunction is the result of yesterday's choices. We see it in Jacob's story. A lot of us probably can see it in our own family story. And if we can't, just look around at the world around us and we can see this reality. That this brokenness just continues to be passed forward. That's where hope comes in. Because yes, today's dysfunction is a result of yesterday's choices, but that means today's choices can undo family dysfunction and shape tomorrow's family culture. Today's choices can undo the family dysfunction and shape tomorrow's family culture. If yesterday's choices have the power over what today looks like in the culture of our families, it means that today's choices have that same power over tomorrow. Because when we get to tomorrow, today is yesterday. And the hope of the good news of Jesus says that the story that has been shaped and passed down to us does not have to be passed on from us. Despite the way that it feels inevitable, despite the way we feel, our family dysfunction isn't genetic. It's not encoded into our DNA. It is a learned culture. It is a learned behavior. And it is shaped by yesterday's choices. And so if today looks more like yesterday's choices than we wish it did, and we want tomorrow to look different, it means we have to make different choices today. In this generation. Whatever cycles have been there can be undone. Don't buy into this lie, guys, that you have to repeat the family dysfunction that has been passed to you. Breaking the cycle will not be easy, it will not always be fun, and it will cost you things. There are times it will cost you some of those broken relationships. But don't buy into the lie that you have to continue the cycle, that what has been passed to you has to be passed from you. Brokenness is a powerful, powerful thing, and you're not going to change it simply by changing your mind, going, yeah, I don't want to do that anymore. But I truly believe the hope of the incarnation of Jesus, that he became like one of us, acquainted with all of our weaknesses. I truly believe the hope of the good news of Jesus and the indwelling power of the Holy Spirit means that real change can happen, and that means that there is real hope. I invite the band to come back. Maybe today, as we've made our way a little bit further in Jacob's story, you might say that you can recognize some generational choices that echo a little too loudly in your family's culture. That you can recognize the way in which yesterday's choices hold a little bit too much power over today's reality. If that's you, and this makes sense, the most important thing you can walk out of here knowing today, guys, is that today's choices can undo family dysfunction. Today's choices can begin to shape tomorrow's family culture, that you don't have to pass on what has been passed to you. Good news of Jesus is better than that. It takes redemptive work. It takes letting the gospel shape and reshape our hearts so that we begin to unlearn some patterns and behaviors that we've just normalized for so long that we think that's just the way it has to be. But there's power in the name of Jesus. When you've had enough of yesterday's dysfunction, today is a day to begin to shape a new family culture. Pray for us.